we want to use these podcasts, these brand new things. We want to use them to discuss some certain issues, and we have Jim Jordan today. And Jim, glad you're here. Appreciate you being willing to do this. We've got a number of questions that have been given to us from a friend, and others will send in questions, I'm sure, as time goes on. But one of the questions is about how the climate of the Reformed branch of Christendom has changed during your lifetime. You've lived a long time. So
Yes.
how has it changed? Has it changed, and what have you noticed?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question given the way things seem to be right now, because when I first came in, sort of into the Reformed faith in the early 1970s, this was part of a revival that had been going on in American Orthodox Protestantism, I guess you could say starting with the Billy Graham Crusades in the early 50s. And out of that came Christianity Today magazine. More and more people began to rediscover the Bible who had been in these kind of humdrum and Bardian neo-Orthodox churches. Then the Banner of Truth began to publish, and more and more people began to become what we think of as Reformed, holding to more classical forms of Christianity. Now, in Dutch Calvinistic circles, there'd been a conservatism there right along in an intellectual tradition and here and there, but we really began to see interest in Reformed faith at that time. Foundation of the Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson was part of that, especially in the South. And when I went to school there, to be Reformed meant that you were within a fairly large circle of conservative, Bible-believing Calvinistic traditions. A lot of books had been written and were being written on various aspects of Christian worldview from a Reformed Calvinistic standpoint, self-consciously thinking along the lines of what we call the antithesis, complete Weltanschauung, or world and life view, history, and other things. And theologically, there was room for discussion on a number of topics. When I was at Reformed Theological Seminary, for instance, I think virtually no one who was in the student classes with me would have been willing to use the phrase covenant of works. They would all have said, well, our forefathers used it, but it's obscure. The confession and catechisms also speak of it as a covenant of life. That seems like be a much better term. We don't want an idea of merit theology. But if some people wanted to use that terminology, there was just discussion, millennial questions and other things. Since that time, I think partly because there's more and more interest in the Reformed faith, there's more and more division over some of these secondary issues that has cropped up. And also since that time, Meredith Klein's dispensational and legalistic merit theology has more or less taken over parts of the Reformed faith. And for some reason, those people are extremely dogmatic and inflexible in their views. They seem to regard the postmillennial heritage as virtually heretical. Anybody who doesn't believe in merit theology is heretical. Anybody who doesn't adopt their dispensational view of history is heretical. All of these are actually new ideas that they have come up with and imposed into the Reformed world, but they've had a real effect of stifling dissent and stifling discussion. And I've seen what I've written on and called the closing of a Calvinistic mind, because I think that that's happening. We seem to be having an awful lot of theology by sloganizing in the churches these days. You don't say the word shibboleth the right way, then you're out. And I don't think that was true 25 years ago.
You know, when we were in seminary, and I believe I entered the same year you did, and one of the things that I remember, and at that time I was still Methodist, and I thought I wanted to be a Calvinist. I was pretty convinced of the 5 points, but I wasn't sure I wanted to be Reformed or Presbyterian.
Yeah.
But one of the things that convinced me was that they told me, the teachers, as I talked to them, they all assured me, said, well, to be Reformed means that you're always conforming to the Bible, and that's what it means. We're always reforming according to the Scriptures. And with that definition, I thought, well, that's fine. I was afraid as you would be coming off of Campus Crusade and other campuses
Yeah.
and all of that. You were afraid of traditionalism and being locked into some position. But they said, no, we understand that the confessions are secondary symbols, that we always are submitting to the Scriptures. We can always change the confessions. There was a very, very open attitude toward study and actually a serious desire, it seemed to me, to reform.
Well, also the case when you and I were at Reformed Seminary that slightly under half of the faculty were not Westminster Confession people. They were Dutch Reformed. And so it was a broad climate of Calvinistic opinion. The same was true of Westminster Seminary. You had a couple of Episcopalian Calvinists teaching up there, Philip Edgecombe Hughes. So the Reformed faith was broad then. Episcopal writers like Hebden Taylor, Philip Hughes were right in the same swim. I get the impression now that, well, of course we've heard recently in Presbyterian circles that if you hold a continental Reformed theology, you should just get out.
I remember
the world is closed.
Yeah, I remember at Reform we had, not only did we had Presbyterian USA. Of course, everybody initially when we got there was Presbyterian USA. The PCA was just forming. But there were men on the faculty that didn't join the PCA, and they were still respected and honored. We had, of course, the CRC men, the Christian Reformed Church men, and we had, but then we had all kinds of men coming in to speak. So we had Philip Hughes, and we had men like Gordon Clark, and the faculty I think dominantly was Van Tillian, but Clark came 2 or 3 times.
Right. Rushdoony used to come for 2 or 3 times.
We had Baptists come from time to time. We had a very wide spectrum of the Reformed world there, and nobody was highly. I don't remember anybody really being savaged or highly criticized.
No, when we were there one time, we got in the Roman Catholic scholar Erich von Kuhnelt-Ledeen, and he talked about Luther and Luther's contributions, and he talked about modern culture of men and women, and the faculty all came out and very much enjoyed listening to him speak. I don't know if those things could happen anymore.
Right. Peter Toon, I remember also another one that came. It was one of those things. Well, the climate has changed, and you mentioned the covenant of works as being one of those things that's become now very. I don't recall in my 20 years in Mississippi presbyteries, or in the whole Southern Presbyterian guys coming out of Reformed Seminary, I don't recall very many men at all who did not take some exception to the language covenant of works, where just it was pretty much a quibble like you just said, but that is almost now completely flip-flopped.
Yeah.
That, and there's some other things, I guess, that now have become much more central and non-negotiable than they were, whereas before those things were really secondary, and we all just, like you said, we all discussed them and argued about them, but no big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I can only ascribe it to the Kleinians, and then to the fact that there's a lot of men in, especially the PCA, who are in the pastorate, who are not particularly theologians, nor necessarily should they be. They're men who are busy with their flocks, and so these hardcore guys come around and say, well, look, we got to believe this, and they say the Westminster Confession teaches a merit theology and a imputation of Christ's righteousness, that he earned these things and they're given to us. Confession actually says absolutely nothing about that, and those things were deliberately left out by the assembly because they were controversial and people took different sides of them. But it's easy to persuade men who aren't scholars and who are busy pastors that these things are important, and there's been a militancy there. I've been quite surprised to hear that John Murray was a terrible person who corrupted the church. John Murray was well thought of when I was in seminary.
Right. In fact, he was one of the ones who was always appealed to for these different views. John Murray he questioned the whole terminology of the invisible church and things. I remember the discussion we had in one of our classes, I think on the Holy Spirit, about regeneration and how Calvin viewed regeneration as it was a whole different way of looking at regeneration. At the time, I really didn't think it was very good, but the point is that all of those things were brought up. They were all discussed. It was all quite open. And it was left for you to think about.
Yeah. I think I think personally a huge amount of the objection to what is being called the federal vision and even the new perspective on Paul is coming from this closing of the mind. I don't think these things would have been controversial 25 years ago because there was a willingness to keep the Bible open and discuss these things. In fact, the first time I ever heard of what is now called the new perspective on Paul was when I was at Reformed Theological Seminary from one of the Presbyterians on the faculty there. Said, we're beginning to think that the Epistle to the Romans is not a systematic theology, but is an occasional letter concerning Jews and Gentiles. And that kind of thing is now regarded as new perspective and quite dangerous, and yet we were all freely talking about it, and so were the faculty.